Okay, so hopefully we got an idea from the Communist Manifesto that Marx's philosophical theory of economics and history is very much an all-encompassing theory, one might say, of everything, with many applications to not just conditions in the workplace, in the factory, even though that is the main focal point of Marx's thought, but also to other things like politics, religion, even art. So our other reading for today from Emma Goldman could be read as her application of very much Marx-inspired thought to another major institution, the institution of marriage. Emma Goldman has also, in recent years, very much been embraced by feminist thinkers as a kind of early forebearer of modern feminism. So before getting to the reading for today, I kind of want to set the stage a bit for Goldman by talking about feminist philosophy in general. With just as with Marx, I have a caveat here, which is the last thing I want to do is kind of mansplain feminism, as they say, but this is my best attempt to convey my understanding of sort of one key approach to feminist philosophy today. And I think that would start by just looking at pretty much all of the authors we've encountered on the syllabus so far this semester. You could even think of any other philosophers, authors from pre-modern times through actually up to present. I mean, it could take a very wide scope, actually, that adopt a male perspective. And so what do the authors that we've encountered so far have in common? Just any things that you may have noticed about the syllabus today, if we can generalize.
For the most part, aside from maybe Marx, a lot of them aren't really working class people.
There's definitely
they're already like, I wouldn't like, essentially near the upper echelon of society.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think, yeah, if we think about last week, we talked about Kant and Mill. I think Kant had a more humble origin story, but eventually definitely attained a comfortable life by the time he was writing his moral philosophy. Mill had a privileged background, certainly many others on the syllabus. Machiavelli, not as much so, but yeah, that would be a common thread. Anything else? Any other generalities we can observe about the authors we've been talking about so far this semester? Okay, Maya pointed out, yes, we've been reading All Men. Anything that about their worldview they have in common? And again, we're talking about a span of more than 2,000 years so far. But is there anything that's sort of jumped out about their writings? Also tended to, yes, this has been a very white middle class syllabus. I think something I said on our very first day of class, but I'll say again now is, the syllabus that I created really represents to a large extent my own education to date in philosophy, which has had a heavily European, heavily male emphasis, which is not to say at all, goes without saying, I think these days, that there are not lots of other traditions from other parts of the world. And we could have just as well started with Confucius in China as we did with Plato and Aristotle in Athens. But yeah, the syllabus sort of kind of oversight is that it is very male dominated, very European, and that's kind of typical of philosophy departments still to this date. But hopefully we can kind of work in starting this afternoon what I would call correctives, for lack of a better term. But one thing I would point out is I'd actually like what Edwin put in the text about men and their power. Okay. Again, speaking on the level of generality, a lot of the authors we've seen so far seem to present themselves as though they are writing about all of humanity in the abstract, the essence of humanity. So when Kant describes a categorical imperative as a moral law that reason gives to itself, it seems like he intends to be talking about human beings at their essence. Similarly, when Locke described the core inalienable rights of men, his term, as a right to self-preservation and a right to property, he seemed to be talking about humanity in the abstract. And there's kind of their approach is part of a long tradition that attempted to philosophize about human beings on the basis of their essence. I mean, we encountered that explicitly with Aristotle, and a supposed virtue of philosophizing about humans by focusing on their essence is that it would discard all of the extraneous, outside, unimportant factors. And that's why Kant would be able to say that his moral law doesn't just apply to privileged individuals in Prussia in the 18th century, but seemingly to all humanity in all times and places. That's a tradition going back to Aristotle, whose virtue ethics, I think, make a claim to all of humanity. But a problem is when that approach is taken, is that it can lead to oversight of potentially key aspects of what human essence is. So just tackling it from an almost metaphysical point of view, if you're starting from a hypothetical blank slate with a goal of describing what the human essence is, what parameters do you set before you even start that inquiry? How do you determine what is essential and what is inessential? So for philosophers like Kant, they seemed to consider gender as a non-essential aspect of human nature. But that would be seemingly a metaphysical error because they made that assumption before they even analyzed and then expounded on what essence was. A feminist philosopher would state, and actually the author I'm completely citing for this is a CUNY professor named Carol Gould, who I've taken a few classes with, points out that there is no philosophically valid reason to assume or to reject gender as a fundamental part of human essence. However, by mostly ignoring gender, major thinkers like Locke and Kant thought they were philosophizing about humanity in the abstract, but made the mistake, one would say, reading them charitably, of taking the male to be the norm by having completely ignored gender. So before I go on, if serious philosophers who I have a great deal of respect for, such as Kant, assume male to be the norm, what follows from that? What problems would arise?
Well, I guess part of like this discussion is like is a bit, I guess, a bit harder for me. Well, not necessarily harder, but like since I'm already a guy as is, I guess I have my like my viewpoint is a bit skewed, but a lot of times because it's generally centered towards like the men's perspective, it'll literally just be from the men's perspective.
Yeah, absolutely. Their philosophy, the sort of traditional feminist critique, would be completely ignores roughly half of humanity. And so, how could you argue that for the validity of a categorical imperative when it appears to be covertly based entirely on a male perspective? Would be one issue. Yeah, absolutely. So Sam put in the text, their philosophy doesn't apply to half of the population of their societies. Maya put in the chat, they think their way of thinking and their experiences are universal. I would agree with these criticisms. Defenders of Kant and Locke would say that their philosophies can be universalized, that even though they were intentionally or not restricted to a male worldview, that things like the categorical imperative can be applied to all human beings. But do we agree with that? And again, what is, if we agree that Kant and Locke and many others effectively ignored women, what specific problems might arise from their philosophies? Like, it seems bad enough in and of itself to fail to take women into account when you are purporting to philosophize for all of humanity. But what follows from that?
I guess the way I can think about it is not really from Connor Mills, but when you go back to like Machiavelli and how he would generally just talk about like princes and kings as opposed to like, I don't know, a princess or a queen. Like I don't really know what his view on those two would be, or if it'd be any different.
It's interesting. A some years ago, I think a book was written that was an attempt at feminist interpretation of Machiavelli, actually called The Princess. I have not read that book, but I would say this kind of criticism we're discussing about Locke and Kant definitely applies to Machiavelli. I think he would definitely be someone who had a male centric, women exclusive worldview. So comment in the chat, as women were being treated as means rather than ends in Kant's time. That is an excellent way of putting it. They weren't being given the rights that were supposed to be for everyone. Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think Maya has a brilliant point in the chat. Kant seems to have been, a harsh reading of him would be guilty of violating the very moral law that he described, viewing women as means and not ends. And there are some writings of his where he does make characterizations of women that we would now consider highly sexist. So yes, it's maybe a case of not practicing what you preach. Other than that, I think a feminist criticism that abounds in philosophy today when discussing Marx, to take a different example, is that while his philosophy, not so differently than that of Kant or Locke, purported to describe all of humanity, his male-centered worldview made him largely overlook problems of capitalism specific to women. And while he spent almost all of his writing focusing on capitalism with some excursions into discussing the family, and was very concerned with his term was the means of production, glib as this may sound, but this is actually a terminology you'll hear today, is he totally overlooked means of reproduction. The whole, it's also called care economy, that exists outside of wages and state regulation, but still is very much centered on labor. So yes, that would be an example of contemporary feminist philosophy looking to a very canonical and I think quite powerful philosophy of Marx's, identifying a seeming oversight that he committed by taking that view that other writers as great as Kant took of thinking they're writing about humanity in the abstract, but ignoring women, and then diagnosing what follows from that and seeing if anything can be salvaged. I mean, there's a whole school of thought which comes up pretty regularly these days that, well, Kant, Locke, maybe even Marx could just be tossed out the window. And, I think that that's a plausible view. I would also contend that there is enough to salvage from their writing, as long as we keep in mind the kind of criticisms that Carol Gould of CUNY and many other feminist writers have made. So with that said, I want to get to Emma Goldman, who, like I was saying, well, first I will read Edwin's chat to everyone that maybe his writing couldn't be effective since he excluded crucial parts such as female recognition, like when building the great city where guardians could be either male or female. I can't remember. Yeah. So, I mean, Edwin brings up a great point. And there's only so far we can actually generalize, I would say, about all of the writers on the syllabus. Yes, I would say Kant and Locke had a strongly male-centric worldview, but it was bringing up the discussion of Plato from a few weeks back, where I think it came up in passing that Socrates in that dialogue stated women were equally capable of becoming guardians, just the same as men, which would have been an extremely, almost unconceivably radical contention 2,400 years ago. So yeah, there's only so much we can paint with a broad brush the whole of history of Western philosophy. It seems like some writers, such as Plato, had their moments, but for those who didn't, again, I would just state, the question is, what do we retain if we think that's worthwhile? What do we discard? What do we modify? Emma Goldman was hugely steeped in Marx, and like I was starting to say, brought a Marxist perspective to bear on the institution of marriage. Also mentioned that she immigrated from Eastern Europe and actually lived and spent much of her life in New York City. So she is, in fact, the only New Yorker really on the syllabus. And also lived during an interesting time in US history, early 20th century, becoming a radical advocate of women's equality. This is decades before women's suffrage became law. Also advocated workers' rights in a Marxist spirit, free universal education, regardless of race or gender, an era when school was definitely not equally accessible to women, and also inaccessible to people of color, because the Civil Rights Act ending systematic discrimination, or aimed at ending systematic discrimination in public services, in voting, and other aspects of life, which is not until well after Goldman died. And she was also a big advocate of free speech. So very much a person ahead of her time. The reading for today, Marriage and Love, is really an all-out attack on marriage, starting with what I take to be a very Marx influenced assertion that marriage is primarily an economic arrangement, an insurance pact. Can someone read, maybe who hasn't spoken yet, the second quote on this page?
The moral lesson instilled in the girl is not whether the man has aroused her love, but rather is it how much? The important and only God of practical American life. Can the man make a living? Can he support a wife? That is the only thing that justifies marriage.
Thank you, Samaya. So before I say anything else, do these assertions early on in the reading for today sound accurate to us?
Yeah, at least to me.
What makes you say that?
So it sort of goes back to like what we were talking about earlier with like I guess like working so much where at least or not working so much but like with like I don't know how some men are with like dating and stuff and how they see I guess with more with like women getting into like higher like degrees or like levels of education, they sort of like felt like although the point of marriage has become less and less because there isn't really the point of having like one main caregiver.
Yeah,
I
I think
saw, I felt like I was like rambling there, but
no,
that's
that's
sort of
fine.
the gist of what I'm saying.
So it sounds like you think this criticism at least partially applies today, or does it apply less today than when Goldman was talking? When Goldman,
Uh, I would say more so today.
just, what does everyone else think? Is marriage primarily an economic arrangement? I'm sure we have all encountered marriage in one way or another. Relatives, TV, on the street. Maybe even some of us have gotten married ourselves. Is this why people get married primarily? And I think what Goldman states is also spells out here is that there's a negative relationship between marriage and women's ability to work. I mean, in her phrasing, a very small number of the vast army of women wage workers look upon work as a permanent issue in the same light as does a man. She seems to be alluding to the practice that for many women in her time, and I think to a great extent today, although you all tell me what you think, there was an expectation of women that they cease to work after becoming married and starting a family. And these passages remind me of something that's much more contemporary that spells out what came up in the first half of class when Sam mentioned educating children, and that's called the crisis of care, according to a contemporary feminist writer named Nancy Fraser, who's noted on the one hand, social reproduction, like she means having and caring for children, is a condition of possibility for sustained capital accumulation. On the other, capitalism's orientation to unlimited accumulation tends to destabilize the very process of social reproduction on which it relies. So there's this conflict that Nancy Fraser talks about in which, on the one hand, capitalism and unlimited accumulation requires social reproduction, namely the bringing of new human beings into the world and caring for them. But on the other, capitalism destabilizes the very process, the possibilities of bringing new people into the world and educating and caring for them. She describes this in 2016 as a crisis, which, even though I have my reservations about Marx, and this would be a Marxist reading, or more specifically, a feminist Marxist, interpretation of care economy today. I think this is spot on.
I think that marriage can be an economic arrangement because I mean, okay, so I have 2 points to this. Like religiously, I guess I'll put religion aside. Um, I feel like there are lots of people who are in long-term relationships for like, I don't know, 7 to 10 years, or some like 4 to like 6 years, but they never want to move on to marriage. Like they're like in love with each other and like they have everything, they've been through everything, but yet they don't want to take the next step onto marriage. And it's like, okay, well, you guys are still going to be together, right? So the only thing aspects that they have to consider, it's like the responsibility of it and then like the economic part of it, where like expenses and like who's taking responsibility for what, who has time for this, because like there's still like the adulting portion, if that makes sense.
Yeah, absolutely. But let me ask you this: those examples that you have in mind, are they, basically people in a long-term relationship who don't formally get married? Are those examples of marriage as an economic arrangement or not an economic arrangement?
um it I have both. Like there are some like economic, I have like an example, like for example, like there are people who they don't like for they both work full time, or some they could, and they both have like really time consuming careers, but they don't have time for like household responsibilities. And when you like move out, you have like your own household responsibilities that you have to take care of, but nobody wants to like cut out some time from their career because they want to be focused on it and driven by it, rather than living with like their family, because there's some people, adults, who still live with their family.
Right. Yeah, no, I mean, I think that's a really great thought-provoking example, which actually ties into the Fraser piece that's quoted on this slide. Basically what you touched on, Samaya, is the two-income household, a very contemporary phenomenon where both partners work to support the household. And Nancy Fraser would say that that is a relatively recent development in the history of capitalism. So I wonder if, even though Samaya, I'm hearing that you pointing out ways in which marriage is and is not an economic relationship, or even when not talking about marriage, but long-term relationships, it kind of is and is not an economic relationship. But Nancy Fraser and Emma Goldman kind of make me think that even today, when there are two-income households, that would seem to suggest a certain women's liberation from getting married for economic purposes. The actual economic component of marriage, the economic foundation of marriage, has just been transformed. And now it's just, whereas previously in much more sexist and at least explicitly sexist time, there was an idea of a one-income household with the woman totally dependent. Now women are able and expected to work, but this is just a modification of capitalist exploitation, according to Nancy Fraser. Is that right?
Yeah, that's right. I feel like now these days, I mean, before there used to be, I remember like in history wise, it was like men were like the primary household income, and they were like the breadwinners, which is like a term that was like created. And then now these days it's a little bit more like modernized, where both of there's two incomes and two people, and then sometimes there's women out there who feel like, okay, went through this entire education and I paid for my education, so like now I feel like I have to like put work onto it because I worked for it. But then there's other women that are like, okay, I have the education and I feel like I'm educated and I have the title, but I don't want to work. I'd rather be a homemaker.
Yeah. Yeah, no, I think that's really interesting. Maya, I see your hand raised, please.
I think kind of one factor is it feels like capitalism has kind of gotten harsher in a way. So like you do need two incomes, most people these days, to to survive. So there is like an economic aspect to it, because like living in New York City, it is so much easier to afford an apartment if you're splitting it with someone.
Yeah, absolutely.
And like, yeah, with marriage, I mean, I have a friend who specifically got married to get on her partner's insurance.
Mhm.
So like I mean, I don't think people sort of want to think that this is why they're getting married or being in long-term relationships, but the basic fact is it's really difficult to make it in our society just on your own.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think I'm sure many of us could. I can definitely think of examples of people moving in together just to afford because rent was much cheaper. I mean, that's such a New York thing, but I think it's not only confined to New York. So to me, the interesting question is for this piece in general is how much of Emma Goldman's critique of marriage applies, almost 100 years after. And while we might want to say so much has changed for the better since then, I mean, there's women's suffrage, inarguably a good thing. Many barriers to entering the workplace seem to have been removed, although there are still plenty of others. On the whole, overall, is if we buy the sort of Marxist argument, is the kind of capitalist warping of human relationships just as much in effect now compared to 100 years ago? Is it more? Is it less? Or is it different? I mean, and I think by your example of like, yeah, the two income household just getting together to make ends meet in a ridiculously expensive city, to me would seem to suggest that if even the details are different, Goldman's assertion that marriage is primarily an economic pact, an economic arrangement, is just as true today as when Goldman wrote it. But Alan, I see your hand is raised.
It was to essentially jump onto what Mayan Samaya was saying about like, I guess essentially like at least now with like the societies or capitals in general just being harsher, it's sort of like necessitates you to like actually like I guess see more of having someone with you to actually help with like monetary things and like sort of and what we that talked about like way early, I think early on in the semester of how like I guess because how individualistic I guess the West is generally, we are sort of forced to not necessarily forced, but like we have to live with either our parents or roommates or something like that and sort of see that as like a problem as opposed to no, it's just the system that's sort of messed up. But also, I guess another thing that to add on to what I was saying again, or as well, is that because people are getting more educated, they sort of haven't realized like I don't really need like more kids, but also from what you were saying that capitalism like wants you to have more kids so you have more workers so the system can keep going.
Yeah, absolutely. It's interesting how, I mean, what I'm hearing from you is that some of the trends diagnosed by Marx more than 100 years ago are still in effect today, but just in altered form. But let me ask you the same question I've been asking everyone. I mean, this Goldman statement, marriage is primarily an economic arrangement, more true, less true, or no longer true? I mean, I'm hearing you say it's to some extent true, but
Yeah, I mean, I've always, at least, I won't like dismiss the idea that like people can marry out of like love and stuff, but just because our society is structured, you can only really it really only benefits people to get married nowadays for the like financial aspect out of it. Because like what I think Maya was saying that she has friends that like marry just for like their insurance because insurance isn't really offered that well
sure.
to people in
Yeah.
this country. And
Yeah.
so I get back to like what Marx is saying, that if people have, I guess the basic needs, they wouldn't really, need to necessarily marry just for the benefit of just getting insurance.
Yeah, absolutely. And I mean, to my mind, this is a seemingly simple sentence, but we can take it very deep. It just depends on how deep we want to take it. That marriage is primarily an economic arrangement. But I'll hold my thought because I see Sam's hand is raised. Yes.
Yeah, I think part of this conversation that's really interesting is to acknowledge like the actual like structural, I guess like the infrastructure we have surrounding and supporting marriage. Like in technicality, like being married, like getting a marriage certificate is very economic. It's very like the joining of the household or the joining of the finances, and it changes your taxes, it changes your social security, it changes, your name, it changes your identity, it changes a lot about you. It changes your social status in society. And I think like for that sole purpose, I think that marriage does have a big like economic aspect, like specifically the way that we've structured marriage in our society. Because I think like now that people have been getting, people have been educating themselves and kind of rejecting societal norms. I think people are starting to realize like we don't actually have to get married. Like, what is marriage? We can just decide that we're life partners, or we can just decide like, yeah, we're going to stay together forever, or yeah, this is my wife. No, we don't have a marriage certificate, but why do we need that? Like, kind of like realizing that like the idea of marriage is not inherently tied to like love. It's not really tied to like a commitment or anything. It really is just like a government thing, which I think is really interesting about it when you think about it like plain and simple. Like marriage itself is not like, oh, I want to be with this person forever, because you can just tell someone like, I want to be with you forever. Do you want to be with me forever? And they can just be like, yeah. It's like you go to the court, you like have a whole like ritual, the whole thing, you sign the papers, maybe there's a prenup involved, there's lawyers, like there's like a whole thing structured in our society to be like, what does it mean to get married? And it's just not like, oh, do you really like this person? You know what I mean? So I think that's a really interesting part of marriage too, which is just like, you could just reject it. You could just be like, I don't care. Like,
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, I think you raised a lot of interesting points. And I mean, the existence of prenuptial agreements would seem to be like the ultimate testament to the economic dimension of marriage on the one hand, but also, like you said, Sam, I mean, there are plenty of people who say they want to be together and can, not technically get married. But that still, to me, raises the question, even though it's, now acceptable in a way it wasn't as much so like in my parents' day, or let alone grandparents' day, to be with someone without getting married. Is the economic dimension still inescapable? And even if we no longer call it marriage or get a marriage certificate, is a relationship between two people still primarily an economic arrangement, according to Emma Goldman? And Sam, while you're on the line, I would love to get your opinion. No pressure, but on this sort of crisis of care that Nancy Fraser brings up, suggesting that we're at a point of unsustainability due to the conflict between capitalism's need for social reproduction, as she terms it, creating and caring for humans on the one hand, versus capitalism's destabilization of that process of social reproduction. But maybe we could get to that later. So I want to go through, before we go into group chat, a few more aspects of Emma Goldman's really impressive polemic against marriage, the institution of marriage. Polemic, if that term is new to you, is just a essay that's like an all-out attack. Comes from the Greek word polemos, for war, a warring essay against the institution of marriage. Emma Goldman goes after the religious and cultural aspects of marriage. We have not yet outgrown the theologic myth that woman has no soul, that she is a mere appendix to man, made out of his rib just for the convenience of the gentleman. So an allusion to the Bible. I'm sure some of us are familiar with the story in Genesis of God creating the first woman by taking a rib out of the first man. So Emma Goldman is pointing out that the institution of marriage comes from this long tradition of seeming to subordinate women to men on the most fundamental, almost mythological level. And with maybe someone who hasn't spoken yet, like to read the second quote.
From infancy, almost, the average girl is told that marriage is her ultimate goal. Therefore, her training and education must be directed towards that end. Like the mute beast fattened for slaughter, she is prepared for that.
Yeah. I mean, I don't think it gets more blunt than that. As far as a criticism of society's treatment of women in Goldman's day goes. But again, we can ask, I think the all-pervading question for this essay is, to what extent does this criticism apply today? Is it more or less? And if we want to say less, that's what I want to say. How sure are we of that? And maybe the last criticism on this slide might actually be highly relevant currently. Strange to say, she is allowed to know much less about her function as a wife and mother than the ordinary artisan of his trade. It is indecent and filthy for a respectable girl to know anything of the marital relation. So what's Goldman talking about here? Sex education. And this is, it's strange to think that this article written decades ago is making a criticism that you can come across today, that sex education, not only in New York City, but throughout the country, is somehow woefully inadequate. There's still so much taboo surrounding it. I mean, I think there's legislative movements in recent years to restrict sex education. But I think Goldman is pointing out the way that that kind of censorship or weird pedagogy warps the institution of marriage. So another angle for Goldman is attacking what in her time, and I think arguably today, are also described as the main benefits of marriage. So I think a bunch of comments were pointing out that some of the benefits traditionally associated with marriage are just no longer seen the same way today, but I wonder which still are. So Goldman contends marriage protecting the child, it's what was typically argued in her time, yet thousands of children destitute and homeless. Marriage protecting the child, yet orphan asylums and reformatories are overcrowded. She also states, marriage guarantees woman a home only by the grace of her husband. There she moves about in his home year after year. Then she attacks the idea of male protection. The very idea is so revolting, such an outrage and insult on life, so degrading to human dignity as to forever condemn this parasitic institution. Do people still get married for protection? Is that the thing? And why would Goldman say this? That it's revolting and an insult on life?
Oh, well, it's something I really perceive or just notice from what my femme friends have told me, is that the way I guess she's defining protection is that when I'm walking with a girl, right? It doesn't matter if we're dating or whatever, because my presence is already there. They're essentially safe from any other man who would like approach them. So it's sort of like I wouldn't say like the existence of like both of us sort of like puts her as like as sort of an object from like other people, and it's something that like us like men generally don't really have to deal with. At least that's how I'm like perceiving it, what she's saying.
Yeah. But why according, so if we could, yeah, I think that's a great example of the kind of individual arrangement that happens, and then society kind of instantly puts expectations and assumptions if a man and a woman are seen together on the street. But
Like to add on to that, like if I like wouldn't exist in this sort of like hypothetical, she wouldn't get like catcalled or people wouldn't like harass her on the street if I was like just existed right next to her.
yeah, so there's, I think, some of that gender role expectation that Goldman's talking about in the context of marriage. Yeah, it seems like you're saying it can and does apply even in non-marriage situations when you're talking about a male and a female. But how would you take that back to, or how would you, is there a way you could apply what Goldman says, this quote at the bottom? We're just talking about marriage in general, and the idea of male protection is revolting and it's an outrage. Does that apply to even momentary non-marriage settings, like literally walking down the street with someone?
I guess in the sense that people don't really want to be infantilized. In the sense they
What do you mean?
like like I guess some people just don't want to be, infantilized.
Okay, gotcha. Yeah, I misheard you. Yeah, so we do still see some of what Goldman's talking about today, it sounds like. But why is this revolting to her, is I guess my question.
I guess she just really doesn't want to be seen as like an object
Yeah,
that needs protection all the time.
yeah, I think that's a great explanation. And yeah, so Edwin put in the chat the insult of not being capable of taking care of herself. Yeah, it sounds like, I think that's also a good, yeah, Alan and Edwin are pointing out that kind of stereotype of woman needing man's protection.
Like the damsel in distress sort of thing.
Absolutely. Yeah, this is totally degrading. And I would add, the reason I can think that she would find it to not just be, an annoying stereotype or something, but actually revolting and insulting is the fact that men, it overlooks male violence against women, and it sort of overlooks that. Maya wrote in the chat, men protecting you from other men, or men could just treat women like people. Yeah, I mean, I think that's a great kind of extrapolation from what Goldman is saying. So I think there's one or two more sort of angles from Goldman I want to go over before breaking up into small group discussion. And here might be where some more of her Marxist side shows. Kind of talked about how Marx has a somewhat vague idea that capitalism alienates the worker from the fruits of their labor, and therefore kind of amputates human nature and prevents true self-development. In the context of marriage, according to Goldman, she'll state, separated by an insurmountable wall of superstition, custom, and habit, marriage has not the potentiality of developing knowledge of and respect for each other. So for her, marriage is inhibiting full development, doing the opposite of one might expect it to do. And then I think in a similar vein, she states, a very small number of the vast army of women wage workers look upon work as a permanent issue in the same light as does man. No matter how decrepit the latter, he's been taught to be independent and self-supporting. So I think that this point would go very directly to what we were talking about at the beginning of this half of class with kind of Carol Gould and other feminist philosophers' critique of the tradition, including Kant and Locke, as completely overlooking women in their discussion of humanity in general. And like Locke, as we mentioned in passing, a few weeks ago, seems to posit a very individualistic view of the political world and the human being that has a kind of limited schedule of rights, but because it's from this implicitly male point of view, as Gould would point out, it seems to exclude women from the same sense of individuality. And that's what Goldman, I would say, is talking about here. Again, a very small number of the vast army of women wage workers look upon work as a permanent issue in the same light as does man. They don't expect job security, would be one gloss on that. And no matter how decrepit the man, he's been taught to be independent and self-supporting. Maybe indirectly or not, whether he reads Kant and Locke or not. There's a whole cultural tradition that has given him that impression, Goldman is pointing out. And then the question, of course, to me arises, and that she addresses in her essay, Marriage and Love, is what is an alternative to marriage? And here it's where she becomes, even for all the preceding pages, a very critical and highly negative comments about marriage. There's a lot of idealism, I think, in her discussion of an alternative to it. And that seems to be a sketch of something like free love. How can such an all-compelling force, love, be synonymous with that poor little state and church-begotten weed, marriage? She says, someday men and women will rise. They will reach the mountain peak. They will meet big and strong and free, ready to receive, to partake, to bask in the golden rays of love. If the world is ever to give birth to true companionship and oneness, not marriage, but love will be the parent. So I'm going to pause the slides and try to do some small group discussion